This is Casey Cannon, and this is the final Vivarium project for the 2023 Herp class. I'm doing it on inland velvet geckos. So this is the final project. As you guys can see, it is a 2x3 tall exoterra, and it's designed to look like a rocky outcropping from the red rock regions of Central Australia. There's a lot of ledges right there for them to climb around on. There's a layer of river sand which mimics what they would see in nature. There's vertical tree trunks, and I tried to use a species with lighter bark just because that's kind of what they have out in nature. There's a lot of bark hides out there, and I used grass as decoration because that's pretty close to what's growing out there. Slide shows a couple of different angles of it. You're able to see down into the bottom a little bit better. I really tried to make this enclosure have a lot of clutter for a lot of different hiding spots. Again, you can see where they can get behind and wedge themselves behind this piece of bark. You've got a darker area down here. You have kind of a crevice that they can get into, another piece of bark. And then we have humid hides. So we have one right there, which is kind of the upper humid hide, then we have a ground humid hide, and then another piece of bark for them to hide on underneath there. This is for are the inland marbled velvet geckos, or Oodura cincta, which this is a species of medium-sized gecko that live on rocky outcroppings in Central Australia. They're very heavily adapted for a saxicoline lifestyle, which means they live on rock faces, along with brush that lives along the rock faces too. For that, they have longer legs and much wider toe pads than a similarly sized gecko. Most animals in this species are going to have lavender and black background with yellow spots, and it's going to vary a little bit by locality, but most of them have 5 to 6 bands that go across their back. And they can change color a little bit depending on time of day, temperature, stuff like that. They are general insectivores, but some species of velvet gecko have been seen licking sap, which is something these guys probably do too. And this species is somewhat social, as are most velvet geckos, and females are known for laying eggs in a communal nest. As previously said, in the wild, these guys do live on rocky outcroppings and the general surrounding areas. And since they are nocturnal, what they do is they will go into these tight little cracks and crevices that are found throughout their habitat and wedge themselves in, like this guy is right here. And these areas are a lot more temperature stable, they're cooler, they're more humid than the surrounding Central Australian desert. And they come out at night to hunt insects and maybe the occasional small vertebrate. But you can see this little guy right here. I saw him when I went to Australia in November of 2018, and they were out crawling pretty much everywhere. They're a very common species out there. They're out on the outcroppings, they're out on the trees. If there's a building in the general area, they kind of live in those too. So there's a pictures show the general habitat where this species is living in. When a lot of people are thinking about Central Australia, they imagine a really flat and hot desert, but that's not quite the microclimate these guys are living in, where you have semi-permanent or permanent rivers that clear out gorges and riverbeds in these areas that make it so that more vegetation, like trees, bushes, you can see a pine right here, that are able to grow. And when they carve down into these rocks, they make a lot of crags and crevices, which the geckos use to escape the heat during the day. So you can see this picture right here. There's a lot of areas for the geckos to hide in. So you can also tell that it's red rocks with river sand on the bottom, which parts of the year this area would be flooded out, and other parts of the year like this, it's going to be empty. But you can see river flowing through the area, and it's not just a dry desert like a lot of people are picturing Central Australia. The ground was painted and built to mimic the red rock banks out in central Australia. As you can see, there are multiple ledges and a lot of texture on these, which will give them a lot of room to run around in. This area right here has a crevice, which they can wedge themselves into like they would in nature. This area down here is kind of a dark spot where when the sand was put in, it gives kind of a more of a humid, dark area, which would mimic, again, what they're going to be having in nature to escape the heat. So I made the enclosure purposely pretty cluttered because that seems to be something that a very secretive nocturnal gecko species would be wanting to have. There are 2 humid hides, which are full of sphagnum moss to mimic the areas in nature where they'd be able to go into deeper crevices and have a more humid ambient temperature and ambient area. A lot of desert species actually use these. They are not directly exposing themselves to the hot, dry conditions of the daytime. They're kind of going into refuges where they can have a little bit cooler and much more humid general environment. Again, we have the bark here, which they can wedge themselves behind. We've got the crevice, and then we have trees right here for them to climb up on, which they can jump to and from the ledges on, which just gives them kind of another extra layer to climb on top of. The grass and the rocks, I thought that they mimicked the natural environment a little bit better, so I put them in. I don't know if the geckos are necessarily going to care, but I think for a aesthetic purpose, they look a lot better. So the substrate for this enclosure is a layer of cypress mulch, which acts as both a drainage layer and a way to hold a little bit more humidity. And on top of it is a layer of natural river sand, which mimics the river sand that you're going to see alongside the gorges. And then the top layer is river rock and a little bit of red clay mixed into the river sand to give it more of a red rock Australian look. This species is primarily nocturnal, so they're not going to be exposed to a lot of daytime temperatures, but I think night and day cycling are very important for a lot of species from this area. So I did include a very high UV bulb, which is the Reptisun 10.0 UVB. I don't think they're going to be using it very often, but if they do come out, it would be much more natural for them to have, as you can see, very high ultraviolet light. I'm using a ZoomEd blue bulb on it, which hopefully will be able to give more of a natural blue and white light when these two are mixed together, and would hopefully stimulate them to breed. As they can see, a summertime high of much higher daylight hours, and then a much lower number of daylight hours in the wintertime when they're brumating. So when a lot of people think about Central Australia, they're picturing it being very hot and very dry all the time, which, as you can see from this chart, during the summertime months, it is very hot during the day, but these are nocturnal geckos, so they're not exposing themselves to these very high temperatures by going outside. They are hiding away and coming out at night. And as you can see, during the day, it's hot, and at nighttime, it is significantly cooler. So when these guys are active, it's probably more like room temperature during the summertime, and during the wintertime, it probably drops down. It can drop down below freezing sometimes, but I think for a keeping perspective and trying to stimulate them to breed, I think dropping them down into the 50s Fahrenheit would probably be fine with a daytime warm-up, which they may or may not utilize in the wintertime. But I think for a nocturnal species, trying to focus on making the daytime temperatures extremely hot is just not realistic. So again, when people are picturing Central Australia, they're picturing a very dry desert, which it is pretty dry. It's not quite as dry as I think you would expect. See, it's going up into the 40s humidity during the wintertime. But these guys are not living out in the middle of the desert. They're living in the gorges, which, as you can see from this picture, Not a lot of vegetation, not a lot of moisture up at the top. Down on the bottom, it's much more vegetated. There's a lot more humid, and there's a lot more permanent water. So where these guys are living, it's probably much closer to, say, 50 to 60% humidity, especially at nighttime, than it is to being bone dry like a lot of keepers would probably expect a Central Australian species to be at. And that's the end of my Vivarium project. These are my citations. I hope you guys enjoyed it.